So I think possibly Natasha was better tuned than I was to this on Wednesday as we listened to PMQs, because sometimes the real meat of the moment lies between the lines that are actually said out loud. Vacillating. Well played, Lee. Lee goes, I'm not having it unobdurate. That was a ridiculous suggestion from Keith. So being a bit vacillating can be as bad as obduracy. Or vacillation. Oh, hello. Roger's thesaurus. Vacillation can be as bad as obduracy. But it became clear on Wednesday, and between you and me, I did need Natasha to point it out to me. It became clear on Wednesday that between the lines of what Keir Starmer was actually saying out loud, it became clear that they were going to undertake some fairly hefty changes to the cuts to the winter fuel allowance, the cuts to every pensioner's winter fuel allowance, whether they are as rich as Croesus or as poor as a church mouse. They were all, well, no, that's not quite true. Forgive me. Not quite as poor as a church mouse. Apart from people who were as poor as the proverbial church mouse, everybody was set to lose it. And in tacking it to an imminent fiscal event, an autumn statement, whatever it may be, he made it absolutely clear that they were going to change it. They were going to do something. And we don't know yet what, but we do know it will be widely described. In fact, listen to the Margaret Thatcher line again and listen to what she says about the media, because this is a really crucial point of the position that Keir Starmer is in right now.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
And Sonny Bono, of course. I forgot about Sonny Bono. My apologies. I got you, babe. I think that's the perfect illustration, isn't it, of what Keir Starmer finds himself facing now. Because Margaret Thatcher rightly points out that if you change your mind in power, you will be accused of a U-turn. Most of us, but not all, recognise that if you don't change your mind when you are, for example, heading towards an iceberg in a massive boat, then you are an idiot. I would perhaps like a more sophisticated or subtle word than idiot, but I can't think of one. If you are in a boat and there is an iceberg in front of you and you refuse to change course because you are persuaded that either there's no iceberg there at all, it's all a mirage, or that your boat is going to cut through the iceberg. This isn't a Titanic analogy because they didn't spot the iceberg in time. You have spotted the iceberg in time and you are refusing to change course. And that makes you very, very foolish. But if you do change course, you come under attack from almost all sides for being weak or for undertaking a U-turn or for being inconsistent. And that is where Keir Starmer finds himself. And I think under that analysis, it would be absurd of us, of you, of me, not to welcome the U-turn, right? Because what is the alternative? You won't find many corners of the media that present this moment to you as clearly as this. What is the alternative? You have two choices as Prime Minister. The winter fuel, and this is contingent upon the consensus that the winter fuel allowance has been by far the biggest misstep of Keir Starmer's administration. We may have a little look at that question, whether it is actually, but I think it must be, unless, back to the immigration obsessives, but just parking them for a moment, it is by far the biggest misstep of Keir Starmer's administration, taking away the winter fuel allowance from people easily portrayed as either deserving or needing it or both. And as you turn that very simple moment into a very simple choice, you either stick with it or you abandon it. If you abandon it, you invite valid criticism and valid questions about why you introduced it in the first place. But in the actual moment of choice, in the crucible of options, there are but two. You either do a Thatcher or you do a Starmer. And what's better? A Thatcher, where you stay on your course even as the iceberg rips into the hull of your mighty vessel, or a Starmer, where you recognise that you have made a mistake, that you have got it wrong, and you change course. It may not be that simple. it may not be that straightforward. It's possible that I am suffering from a touch of the old footballification that I often criticise others for. But in order to say that Starmer is wrong to do it, you'd have to explain to me why you think he should leave the winter fuel allowance cut in place. And I think we all recognised pretty quickly that it was far too blunt an instrument for the challenge that it was supposed to address. That thresholds and cut-off points were too stark. So there it is. Imagine, writes Lauren, criticising a captain of a ship for ordering a course correction. Is the captain supposed to just say, sail straight ahead forever? Sarah points out the parallels with Brexit and, of course, the continuing refusal by much of the country, or at least much of the political and media establishment, to recognise the disaster that they have undertaken. Richard in Harrow makes that John Maynard Keynes quote, which is almost certainly not a John Maynard Keynes quote, but I spent 10 years passing it off as the real McCoy, so I can hardly criticise him. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? And that's the question, really. It's not a particularly tricky one. It's not a particularly sophisticated one. I just really want to know how... And the reason I've taken a moment to lay it out in those terms and to resurrect the ghost of Margaret Thatcher, which few will thank me for, the reason I've done that is because when it actually happens, the media will go bonkers again. The media will turn into a rabid dog of snarling canines. We're a bit better than that now, together, you and me, on this programme. We're a bit cleverer than that. It's a failure by the Labour government. But the question of what the U-turn will do to you is a question that only you can answer. And I would really like you to answer it now. 0345 6060 973. What will you do? What will you fit? How will you respond to the U-turn when it comes? What does it do to your opinion of Keir Starmer? That's the fundamental question. What does it do to your view of this government? Because the catastrophic council results of a few weeks ago were chalked up largely, of course, to the incoherent unhappiness of many, many people who were drawn to the latest snake oil salesman on the block, which unfortunately is the same as the last snake oil salesman on the block and the snake oil salesman on the block before that, the bloke who sold you Brexit, the bloke who sold you Boris Johnson, the bloke who called Liz Truss's budget the best he'd ever seen. I give you, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Nigel, currently on holiday, Farage. That was a large part of the collapse in Labour's support. But what the campaigners came back and said was that it was also down to the winter fuel allowance. So if he changes it, what will it do to your view of him? And I'll tell you what, because we're all experts now, what changes would you like to see? What changes would work for you? 0345 6060 973.